Hello and welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be talking about an influential essay in environmental ethics by Tom Regan. We're also going to really begin the question today of animal rights. And the name of this essay is Animals as a Subjects of a Life. So we're going to explore Tom Regan's defense of animal rights and its implications. In many ways, we'll see that he's going to argue that animals have an inherent moral worth. He's going to talk about what that moral worth consists in. And then he's also going to argue that because of that, we have a right not to simply treat animals as a resource. So we've been looking at in our previous videos about non-anthropocentrism and anthropocentrism and a whole bunch of different questions about value. Today, we're going to really focus in on animals. And we should also mention that Tom Regan's work has been an essential contribution to the animal rights movement, at least in the theory side of in terms of its theory and its philosophical underpinnings. So let's explore this. Let's talk about animal rights movement. What Tom Regan calls for is an abolition of our use of animals simply and merely as a resource. He positions himself strongly and firmly as an advocate for animal rights, and he asserts that the movement of animal rights, or the animal rights movement's objectives, are more than just reform, more than just picking up and being nicer to animals. He thinks that the key goals in particular is to abolish the use of animals within scientific research, two, to abolish the use of animals within commercial agriculture, and then three, to abolish the use of animals within hunting and trapping and using animals for sport. And Regan emphasizes that the core issue here ultimately transcends just this question about whether or not we're being cruel to animals. And in fact, he's going to challenge what he calls the cruelty account. And he thinks that ultimately this view is rooted in systemic beliefs that view animals merely as something for us to exploit. And that's ultimately what he's against. So let's talk a little bit about Tom Regan, right? I pulled this quote in from the essay here, and the pagination comes from our textbook or our anthology. He writes, "I used to think I understood this reasoning. Not anymore. You don't just change unjust institutions by tidying them up." And I love that idea. Ultimately, he wants to say is, listen, if we're actually going to be for animal rights, then we actually need to take it seriously and not just say, let's just not allow for animal cruelty, but let's still have factory farming, or let's have, for instance, if you're against factory farming, but you're still okay with the use of eating animals, and instead you buy free range chickens and things like that. He says all you're doing there is trying to tidy up the issue. The core issue is the use of animals simply and only as a resource. And what we need to do is abolish that. So he's something of a radical here. He's a prominent philosopher and advocate. So just a little bit about him. He is effectively known for his significant contributions to the animal rights advocacy work of the 20th century. And he really laid the groundwork for the modern animal rights discourse. Now, academically, he actually taught at the University of South Carolina, where he would go on to actually influence generations of students and scholars in moral and social philosophy, but consistently emphasizing the ethical treatment of animals. His key book here is The Case of Animal Rights, and it presents a comprehensive theory that defends animal rights. And it's often a sort of parallel text to John Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice, for its depth and its rigor. But instead of just thinking about justice like John Rawls, he's really thinking about animal rights. And the essay we're looking at today in many ways provides a window into his overall and his much more comprehensive theory. Now, ultimately, his argument here is when we say animal rights, is that he wants to articulate in this essay what the philosophical foundation for rights are. And his approach is to establish that animals are beings that have moral rights and they have moral standing and they're worth our consideration. This challenges the traditional view that's usually advocated for, and in particular Kant. And we're going to see that he's going to directly address Kant in particular. I figured I'd pull a quote from the text. He writes, quote, "But what is wrong isn't just the pain, isn't just the suffering, isn't just the deprivation. These compound what's wrong. Sometimes often they make it much, much worse, but they aren't the fundamental wrong. The fundamental wrong is the system that allows us to view animals as our resources. Oops, a little spelling error there I missed. That are here for us. Where we just view animals as a resource here for us to be eaten, surgically manipulated, experimented on, exploited for sport or for money. Once we accept this view of animals, that they're just our resources, the rest, in terms of the cruelty of animals and the misuse of animals, is predictable, as it is as predictable as it is regrettable. I kind of mangled his quote there, but you get the point. Is we can talk about the pain and suffering that animals experience potentially at the hands of human beings, but that's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that we see them as just a resource for us to use. The same way I'm using this computer, it's something I can manipulate and do what I want with. If we start to begin to see animals like that, then of course we're going to end up creating conditions in which they have pain and suffering. And of course, this is bad too. He's not going to deny that cruelty is not a bad thing. He thinks that cruelty is bad, but it's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem, again, is viewing them purely as instruments for our own use. Now, in order to do this, Regan is going to specifically address the Immanuel Kant account. He calls it the Kantian account. And again, just to remind myself, we already posted a video and we talked about this. Kant's view was that ultimately you shouldn't treat animals wrong because it leads to a mistreatment of human beings, right? Kant's view was that you have a direct moral duty to other human moral agents. You only therefore have an indirect moral duty to animals. But ultimately, put it this way, is on your way to treating humans well, we should treat animals well. Now, that seems nice, but you might think of it as a sort of spillover effect. The only way that animals actually calculate into our moral considerations is when our calculations for human beings spill over into thinking about them. Notice here, there seems to be something wrong about that. Regan's critique is that this view is essentially speciesist, and he'll actually specifically cite Peter Singer, who we're also going to be talking about, and he argues that this sort of speciesism, just like racism or sexism, right, or any other ism we might think of. I was trying to think of another one, right? Speciesism, racism, sexism, these are all wrong because ultimately what they do is they say one group matters and the rest don't really matter. And this means that speciesism says, I only care about the human species, the rest of the species don't really matter. So this means that this view inherently, that this fails to recognize the inherent suffering that animals actually experience. And this also seems to deny the fact and ignore the fact that this is a moral concern in its own right. Think about it this way. I think it's probably likely that future generations will look back on our culture today. And they'll probably look back and say, look at these human beings, how they look at our ancestors, how they were unable to recognize that animals actually had moral worth and moral standing. And maybe you feel like, oh, I don't want to be cruel to animals. But let me ask you, did you eat meat today? Are you a vegetarian? If you're not, then that means you're using animals. And you don't have to, actually. In fact, we know it's even healthier not to eat meat for the most part. So there's a question here. Regan's critique is that ultimately animals have moral standing. He emphasizes that animal suffering can't be justified merely because of its potential consequences for humans. And this means that we need a more inclusive ethical framework. We need an ethical and a moral evolution that includes and recognizes the moral standing and the moral value that members of our world who are not our own species have or hold. So this means that we need to, if we're going to have an animal rights movement, it's a call for the abolition of using animals in this way. And he advocates, again, for the complete abolition of practices that exploit animals, and we need to reject notions of humane treatment that actually still allow for animals to be used as our resources. He thinks that the animal rights movement, if it's just organized as a question of not being cruel, right, and just thinking about the notion we should treat animals humanely, he thinks all of these are examples of the problem. The animal rights movement if it's to succeed in a morally viable and valid way, it needs to fundamentally reshape societal perceptions of animals and to ensure that they are recognized as beings with inherent moral value and moral rights rather than just tools for our benefit. So what he wants to do is critique, Regan wants to then move over and critique some of the accounts regarding animal ethics that exist. First off, we've already mentioned that the Kantian account in his view is a speciesist view because ultimately it dismisses animals as having value simply because they're members of the wrong species. So Regan is going to dismiss this as speciesist because it neglects the intrinsic moral worth that animals have. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, what is the intrinsic moral worth of animals or humans even based upon that? And don't worry, he'll get there. We're going to get to that. The next thing is what he calls the cruelty account. So the cruelty account is the account that we ought to treat animals, and we can use animals as a resource, but not be cruel to them. So the cruelty account is a way of thinking about animal rights, but it's very minimal. So it's basically don't kick your dog, but you can do whatever else you want with your dog. The idea here is that the cruelty account, and this fits within all the different versions of animal rights that focus on cruelty, that ultimately cruelty emphasizes the mental state of the agent. Because if you are doing something cruel, then the only way we know that it's cruel is if you have the intention of actually being cruel and harming. And so, for instance, he actually quotes John Locke in this view. And he says, and here's John Locke talking. He says, John Locke says, one thing I've frequently observed in children, that when they've gotten possession of any poor creature, they're apt to use it ill. They often torment and treat very roughly young birds, butterflies, and such other poor animals which fall into their hands, and that with a seeming kind of pleasure. This, I think, should be watched in them, and if they incline to any such cruelty, they should be taught the contrary usage. For the customs of tormenting and killing of beasts will by degrees harden their minds, even towards men, and they who delight in suffering and destruction of inferior creatures will not be apt to be very compassionate or benign to those of their own kind. So John Locke takes a view which is very similar to Immanuel Kant's, arguing that we shouldn't be cruel because it cultivates bad character in us. How do we define cruelty, though? Right? Regan says cruel is a term of moral appraisal that's used to refer either to the character of a person or to an individual's actions. Persons are cruel who are inclined to delight in, or even, as Locke says, to take a seeming kind of pleasure in causing pain. Sorry, there's a number of little typos there that I missed. So that means that basically the idea is cruelty is when you take pleasure in the suffering of another creature. Obviously, that's morally wrong. Regan agrees that's morally wrong. But his view here is that it's not good enough when we're thinking about animal rights. Why? Because determining cruelty requires that we know the state of mind that the person has while they're inflicting pain. Do they experience the pleasure of cruelty? Now, notice here that scientists who inflict pain on animals are actually likely not cruel. I doubt most scientists who are performing animal experiments or vivisections are actually enjoying the experience, even though they're doing an experience which causes great harm on them. Think about something called the Dries test. The Dries test is a test that was developed in the 1940s in order to test the toxicity of chemicals, of household chemicals for us. Think about your shampoo. In fact, it's highly, highly likely that the shampoo you're using right now was actually subject, or they used the Dries test to make sure. Because if you get shampoo in your eyes, we all know it can burn your eyes. But we don't want you to go blind, for instance, and we don't want it to be excessive. So the Dries test worked by putting liquid chemicals into the eyes of animals, usually rabbits, because rabbits' eyes are very similar to humans, and then doing it to the point where the animals would go blind. So that way we could know how much of a chemical is required before it causes blindness. And that experience was extremely painful to these rabbits and animals. And one thing here is that for many, many years, even though we actually knew what these chemicals were and how dangerous and at what levels they were toxic to human beings, we continued to use the Dries test every time there's a new shampoo. Now, there seems to be something fundamentally wrong with that. But the point here is that while that test is occurring, it's not probably done under conditions of cruelty. I suspect that very few of the scientists who did these tests enjoyed doing the test, perhaps some of them, and that would be morally problematic, but they just did the test because they had to, as it were. His view here, Regan's view, is that that doesn't make the test morally right, right? But is the test wrong? Regan's view is that this question is logically distinct from the question of cruelty. So we can say there's two different ways of asking a question. We can ask, is there cruelty? There we have to know the state of mind of the individual. We have to know if another individual is suffering, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, a logically different question is it wrong? Notice that, for instance, I can commit a wrong against you and not have ill intentions or pleasure in doing it. For instance, imagine you have a computer and you're at Starbucks and you're, on your computer, you go to the bathroom and I take your computer. Maybe I take your computer because I really, really need to use a computer for my own and I feel bad about it. So I don't experience the pleasure of cruelty, but it would still be morally wrong for me to take your computer. In the same way, we can see there's something that's logically different about the question of the wrongness of an act and the question of the cruelty of an act. We certainly are going to agree that cruelty is morally wrong, but that doesn't mean that we've completely figured out the question about whether or not our use of animals is wrong. Regan writes, "Some will complain that my argument's too picky. They might say that cruelty has been interpreted too narrowly. What is meant is treating animals badly in ways they don't deserve, harming or wronging them. In other words, what's really wrong is the question of if we treat them badly." So, from there, Regan then moves to think about utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism in particular is defended by Peter Singer. And Peter Singer is an important thinker within the animal rights movement, and he uses utilitarianism ultimately to argue that animals should have rights. So we're going to be looking at Peter Singer's account here in a little bit. But Tom Regan, by the way, this essay was originally published in a book edited by edited by Peter Singer. So these two philosophers know each other, and they certainly respect each other. But in this case, Regan disagrees. He thinks utilitarianism is not good enough. Now, for those of you who are watching this and are unfamiliar with utilitarianism is the idea that you ought to promote the greatest amount of happiness in the greatest amount of people. Or let's put this, the greatest amount of happiness in the greatest amount of moral members and moral agents. So this means that, for instance, we should minimize pain, but allow suffering if that can stop greater harms from occurring. But the utilitarian account, as Peter Singer defends it, emphasizes the notion that we should have equal consideration of interest. The idea that my interest as a human being should also be considered equally with the interest of animals and the interest of other ecological creatures, right? And that what we ought to do is we ought to recognize an overall framework in which we promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of beings. And that means we might actually need to sacrifice some individual animals for the sake of a greater overall welfare. But this actually means we might fail to protect animals against exploitation. So utilitarianism, on Regan's view, is insufficient for ultimately safeguarding this problem of harm. Regan writes, "This equality of interest principle seems to provide a philosophical basis for avoiding the grossest forms of prejudice, including racism, sexism, and, following Ryder and Singer, speciesism." So at the very core of utilitarian is this notion that there should be an equality of interest principle, namely that we want to maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, or the greatest, and by people I mean any beings. But by maximizing them, we have to consider the interest of all of these different agents equally. So that means that my interest to live a life where I have air conditioning and electricity, or I have heating in the winter and I have food and all of that, has to be equally weighed with the interest that horses have, or the interest that, for instance, trees have, and so on and so forth. And I ought to avoid speciesism, just determining what my actions are wrong or right based upon which species I'm involved with, and instead look at all of the species and all of the interest in treating them equal. But here's the trouble. The trouble is that there's no necessary connection, no pre-established harmony between the respect for equality of interest principle and the promoting the utilitarian objective of maximizing the balance of good over bad. On the contrary, the principle of utility might be used to justify the most radical kinds of differential treatment between individuals or groups of individuals. And it might justify forms of racism or sexism, even, for these prejudices can take different forms and find expression in different ways. Here's what Regan's view is that utilitarianism overall can justify doing horrible things to animals and to human beings. For instance, consider, would it be morally wrong for me to experiment on one human being and cause them great harm and suffering and kill them if it created pleasure for, let's say, 10 million people? In that case, the utilitarian would argue, well, 10 million people's happiness is a lot greater than one person's happiness. Therefore, it would be justified. Or another example, for instance, if imagine you have a small group, and by the way, I don't really believe that there is such a thing as race, even though race is a sociological category in my view. But let's think about races. Let's imagine you have a society, a culture, or a community where you have everyone, the 99% of people are of one race, and you have 1% that's of another race. Would it be right to justify mistreating the 1% if it benefited the 99%? You can see here that if utilitarianism is about maximizing the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people in terms of the consequences of the actions, then it would follow that it would be justified to mistreat that race or that species or that sex. So the problem here is that utilitarianism, and by the way, Singer disagrees with this, but the problem is that utilitarianism ultimately can be used to justify a whole bunch of horrible things that we would be against morally. So what are some of the problems? Well, one is who counts within the utilitarian calculation, right? Notice that, for instance, think about the U.S. Constitution when it was originally written. Well, Africans who were enslaved didn't count in the calculation. In the same way, we're liable to make similar sorts of problems because if we're utilitarians, we're human beings. Human beings have biases, which means our biases might just discount people. Number two, here's another example, is I've been thinking recently because there's a lot of discussion for instance, about immigration. Utilitarianism, right, would say if the majority of people are citizens within a nation and a small minority are immigrants, then maybe we could justify the mistreatment of immigrants if it maximized the happiness of the citizens. Notice, this is just another version of racism or sexism or speciesism. The question of who counts within the moral calculation is a major problem within utilitarian moral theory. Now, the utilitarians will argue that everyone has to count and everyone should count equally. The problem is who gets to decide who is everyone, right? Number two, are the different interests of each of these animals actually taken into account equally, right? And there's a question there of what does it mean to understand the interest of a horse versus a chimpanzee, or the interest of a butterfly versus the interest of an eagle, right? How are we supposed to take all of these different interests into account and actually consider them equally? Now, it's possible we might, but think about the policies. Ultimately, a lot of this stuff comes down to what our political, practical policies are. And here's the thing. Even if we take those interests into account equally in our moral consideration, will our policies? Notice that policies set by the United States are meant to benefit the United States, and in particular to benefit the citizens of the United States. Which means that, for instance, I would argue that the policies of the United States government do not indeed take everyone's interest into account, right? They take a select group of interest into account and then disregard other people. So there's a question about who counts, which are different interests counted equally. But then there's a question of just the policies. Can the policies be enacted equally? And then lastly, even if interests are all taken into account, are the consequences of our actions actually all taken into account? So here's the problem, Regan suggests, is that utilitarianism might actually be used to support speciesism if used in a different light than Singer. Singer, again, we'll look at him. He's a utilitarian, or was a utilitarian when he wrote the essay we're looking at. And he doesn't think it supports speciesism because he coins this term speciesism. But you can see here, theoretically, utilitarianism could be the groundwork for a form of speciesism. So this means that we're rejecting the Kantian perspective on cruelty. We're rejecting the account, and Regan's rejection of that is that ultimately it's fundamentally flawed because we have to take the interest into account. And then what we also want to do is focus on that. We looked at the cruelty account. The cruelty account focuses on agents' intentions, but that's inadequate in moral philosophy. So where are we at? Let's restate our claims. It looks like the moral principle that we're after in animal rights can't refer simply to an agent state of mind. It can't be just your perception and your will and your intention. Number two, the principles we're after for animal rights can't just refer to the consequences of our action, just maximizing benefit. And number three, whatever principles we wanted to articulate for animal rights, they can't be based on just a principle of balancing the pains and pleasures which are experienced by animals or in humans. So what is the proper case for animal rights? Regan's going to call this the rights account. Okay. Now, his rights account is based on the theory that animals shouldn't be treated merely as a resource for human use, but that we should recognize that animals are also, quote, subjects of a life. They're beings that have beliefs, desires, and they have emotional lives. They have passions and experiences. And that ultimately, because they have all of these, because they're subjects of a life, they therefore have an intrinsic worth that grants them moral status. And that's what enables us to recognize that they do indeed have an inherent moral value. Just put it this way, you have a life and you're experiencing that life. Any other being that has a life and is experiencing it also has moral value, right? Individual rights normally trump collective interest. So in a normal situation, right, we say that your right not to be killed trumps the collective interest. So for instance, you can imagine, imagine you have a city with 10 million people and you have 100 slaves, and those slaves do all the really nasty work no one else wants to do. Notice that we think that's morally wrong right now. Why? Because people have individual rights, and those rights have to be respected and protected. And those rights don't just get overridden because everyone else benefits, right? So this means that individual rights are paramount, and that we don't normally trump them or ignore them or override them simply because there might be a collective reason to do so. Now, it is possible for us to do this. And so there is a question of, well, when should an individual's right not to be harmed be overridden? So there might be exceptions. What are the exceptions? Well, one, maybe we'll override someone's individual right when it prevents some sort of vastly greater harm. Number two, we would also have to recognize that it's necessary in terms of the causal chain of events to violate someone's right in order to avoid a vastly greater harm. So we have to recognize that we could prevent it and that it's necessary. And number three, that it's the only way. If the only way to avoid a vastly greater harm is to trump individual rights, then we would allow it to do it. So for instance, an example I was thinking about is, for instance, parents have the individual right to raise their children how they want to. But that's not always the case. We're willing to override a parent's right to decide if we think that right is a part of a causal chain of events that creates greater harm, and it's the only denying that right is the only way to avoid that harm and thereby prevent it. If those three conditions are met, then we will allow ourselves to override individual rights. But other than that, we're going to generally say that those rights have to be protected. So that means that the task then requires us to understand what is inherent value, and understand what makes a being have inherent value at all. That is, what is the source of their rights? And this means we have to understand the idea of subjects of a life. Number one, any being is a subject of a life if it has complex mental states. So we're not talking about bacteria here, which don't, so far as we can tell, have complex mental states. What is a complex mental state? Well, a complex mental state includes things like beliefs, desires, emotions. It also concludes capacities that enable a being to experience life in some sort of meaningful way, which is essential for recognizing their moral standing. I recently saw a video on Reddit where there was a little baby horse that was trying to cross like this old rickety bridge, and it fell into the bridge and it couldn't move, and it had to sit there for hours. And for hours, the mother horse just stood watch over it because the horse doesn't have arms and hands. It wasn't able to pull up its baby. But the fact that that mother horse sat there with the baby horse, and then when there was a farmer or whatever, the farmer came and pulled that little baby horse out. And as that person was walking the baby horse across the bridge carefully and safely to the other side, the mother horse slowly watched and took note. That reveals to us that horses, like horse mothers, like human mothers, have complex moral states in which they care and have emotions and desires for their young. This helps us recognize that they are also subjects of a life, and therefore we have to recognize that they too have moral standing. Another category here is what we call temporal awareness. The beings which are subjects of a life also have memories, they have senses of a future, and this allows them to learn from past experiences and plan for what's ahead. Now, obviously, human beings, because we have complex forms of language, we're able to really plan for things well into the future, maybe more than animals. But I know just from having my dog that my dog has a temporal awareness, because every day at 5 o'clock, no matter what, my dog comes to me and barks because it wants to be fed, which means that all day that dog is expecting to be fed in the future. It has temporal awareness, and therefore it recognizes that my dog is having an experience of a life. And that experience includes its recognition that there's a past, a future. Think about, for instance, if you've ever harmed an animal, that animal no longer usually will trust you, right? That reveals that it has temporal awareness. And because it has temporal awareness, it is the subject of a life, and therefore it has moral significance. And because of this, we can think of these kinds of attributes which tell us and characterize what it means to be the subject of a life. And this means that they have an inherent value. And therefore, any being which has these complex forms of awareness and experience, they should not be treated simply and only as a resource. So this moral perspective supports the idea that animals have rights and that they actually need to be protected from serious exploitation. Okay, so Tom Regan posits that inherent value is characteristic of beings that exist independently of external valuation. And this principle applies to both humans and many animals, suggesting that if humans possess inherent value, many animals do too. And this foundation allows for the argument that animals have moral rights and that they have to be recognized and protected. Now, Regan says, and I put a quote here from my textbook, sorry for the underline. He says, I haven't proven that animals have rights or even that human beings have rights. Rather, I've argued that if humans have rights, so do many animals. So Regan's view really is the idea that what gives us our rights? Our rights are given on the fact that we're experiencing the world and we value those experiences and we want those experiences protected. Well, if animals have an analogous experience, then they should be treated analogously in the moral sense. So what are the implications? Well, at present, the rights view asserts that individual rights take precedence over utilitarian considerations. And this forbids the sacrifice of one for the benefit of many. And so the abolition of practices like factory farming, vivisection, which is another word for talking about animal experimentation, and sport hunting is mandated, as these violate the rights of animals. So in other words, his view here is that we should straight up make factory farming and we should make animal experimentation and sport hunting illegal, straight up, because this violates the rights of animals. Now, you may not like this. Maybe you're a hunter, or maybe you are a cancer survivor and you needed that animal experimentation, and you liked the chicken because you were hungry. You may not like it, but here's the question. Isn't it ultimately rational? Are you willing to trust, just go with your gut instinct of what feels like the right thing to do? Or are you willing to use your reason? And the question is, what is your inherent value based on? Isn't it based upon the fact that you're experiencing your life and you want to experience that life in the best way possible? In the same way, shouldn't you also extend that rationally to other beings, namely animals, which also have those experiences? We may not like the implications of his view, but it's fairly straightforward. He argues that we have an imperative to abolish these forms of using animals. And again, particularly the three-part list is we should abolish animals in agriculture, we should abolish animals in experimentation, and we should abolish animals when it comes to sport or hunting in particular. And that gives us a sort of broad strokes view of what Tom Regan's view when he writes that animals are subjects of a life. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and provocative. I'll see you guys online. Oh no, no, don't tell me.